This week in the nation's capital reminded us that our financial security and our very right to vote are under threat from conservatives in Congress as well as the Supreme Court. On Friday, billions of dollars in automatic spending cuts, known as sequestration, went into effect. Many of those cuts will affect communities of color in a huge way. We'll discuss that later in the show. But first, a voting rights rally was held Wednesday on the steps of the Supreme Court. Inside, the justices seemed on their way to overturning key protections for minority groups contained in the Voting Rights Act, first passed in 1965. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was at the White House as the bill was signed into law, and his son, Martin Luther King III, spoke at Wednesday's rally.
If the court chooses to strike down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, then we understand what our mission is. We should be making it easier for folk to vote, not putting more restrictions in place to keep people from voting. That is what my dad and others gave their lives for.
I think that the height of insult to me is when Justice Scalia said, this seems to be a continuation or propensity of racial entitlement. No, Justice Scalia, what it is the continued discrimination, is the propensity of white racial entitlement to stop us from voting.
We have in the past 2 years seen the greatest legislative attack on the right to vote that we have seen in more than a century. And yet, and still, we find ourselves back at the Supreme Court staring at the Senate, where in 2006, 98 out of 100 senators, virtually all the Republicans and all the Democrats, stood up and said we must reauthorize the Voting Rights Act.
That was Benjamin Jealous, president of the NAACP, and he's here with us today, along with Ohio Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Folks, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was a stunning week in terms of the juxtaposition of the Supreme Court having oral arguments dealing with Section 5, and right across the street, at the exact same time, the dedication of a statue to Rosa Parks in Sanctuary Hall. And you heard Mitch McConnell and John Boehner there in Congress talking about her courage when it came to fighting for what's right and standing up for the right to vote, knowing full well what's happening across the street.
Yes. Yes. No, look, we're in a weird moment when it feels like history can move two ways at once and it's kind of swirling around at the center. And you felt that in Washington this week. To hear Scalia refer to the protection of voting rights as a racial entitlement with no sense of irony. No sense of irony, right? That right between me and Scalia was John Lewis. And you could just feel the oxygen get pulled out of the room. And I was trying to just think how stunning it must be. I mean, he had his skull cracked on the bridge from coming out of Selma because he was fighting against racial entitlement, because he was fighting against segregation.
In fact, today, in terms of in Selma, they're having the reenactment of that march.
That's right.
And Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed because he was trying to register the folks to vote.
You know, Roland, what really bothers me more than any of it is just the hypocrisy. To stand in Statuary Hall and talk about Rosa Parks, knowing that some of these very same people are doing everything they possibly can do to make it difficult for people to vote, poor people, students, the elderly, minorities. And then we go and sit in the Supreme Court. Ben and I were both sitting there. We knew that we were going to probably be in a situation where there would be 4 people that strongly were supportive and 4 that were not. But to hear Scalia say what he said without even any hesitation, right, and to sit and allow that to be said without being challenged. You know who challenged it? Sotomayor. Not the only African-American on the bench.
That's right. I mean, Thomas was sitting right next to him. Now, you have 8 of the 9 justices fully engaged. You have 1 that's silent.
Right. And his deal is, hey, allow the lawyers to talk. No need to sit there and ask questions. But you would think something in the Georgia in him, something would have stirred up and said, now, wait a minute, hold up now. I mean, you know you my guy, but.
But, Roland, even the law should have made him say something. The Supreme Court only responsibility is to really determine if there is a constitutional issue. For them to ask questions like, do you think people in the South are more racist than people in the North, was irrelevant. The question before them is not whether Section 5 should be expanded, which in fact it should be, but the question is Section 5 constitutional, even in the states where they are challenging it, which is the question. And they talked all around it.
What also amazed me, though, when you look at those particular questions, in essence, they were also challenging the fact that Congress overwhelmingly passed the reauthorization.
Because what Scalia actually did is he built up to his racial entitlement remarks. And he did it by saying, look, back when this was passed, there were 18 senators who opposed it. Then you fast forward to the 70s, and there's 9, and then there's 8, and then there's 2 who abstained and 98 report. And rather than saying it was because of, say, the 15,000 pages of testimony, or the fact that right before this in 2006, in Kilmichael, Mississippi, in the early 2000s, they canceled an election because they were going to have their first black majority. Rather than pointing to that, he says, it's because of this phenomenon of racial entitlement. And he talks about how basically the legislators
Black folks were scared to vote against it because they'd be called
as if these very same men, many of them don't oppose affirmative action.
Right. These very same people who held up VAWA for 18 months, the very same people who wanted to approve all of these laws across the state, across our states, talking about voter ID, no early vote. All of these same people who supported all of that, now all of a sudden they're afraid to vote against something?
The court will expected to rule by June. Most folks think that there are 5 votes there to make changes to it. For African Americans, what's next? And not just African Americans.
Sure. First of all, we got to remind Hispanics and Vietnamese and others. There are many other people who have been able to benefit from Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act when you look at those multi-language ballots and other states as well. So it also shouldn't just be black folks out here demanding this be held up. But go right ahead. Yeah, no, first of all, I wouldn't be so sure.
Okay.
Kennedy could go either way. He asked questions that suggested he may go either way. And quite frankly, last time we were in there less than 5 years ago on the Texas mud case, the people were pretty dejected coming out of the court, and yet we won. So there's a real possibility that we win. Either way, we have to recognize that voting rights are under attack in state capitals across the country. We need to be engaged in pushing back. We've had luck even getting some Republican senators to veto these bills when we're engaged. Right. And we have to be organized. I mean, one thing I'm very proud of is that the black community has consistently gone from strength to strength from 96, 2000, 2004, 2008, 2012 in building up our participation. We've got to keep doing that.
Congresswoman, although your state doesn't fall under the VRA, but again, here's an example. We saw last year the kinds of very clear actions. They were all about preventing folks from accessing the ballot box.
Ohio ought to be covered by Section 5. If you look, we had 2 lawsuits in the state of Ohio to preserve early voting. We fought with our Secretary of State for almost 2 years. We had probably more actions against us in terms of trying to suppress the vote than they did in some southern states. Right. So it should be expanded. There's no question about that. But I also want to say that in Congress, we have formed a coalition with the Hispanic Caucus, the Asian Pacific Caucus, the Progressive Caucus, and the Black Caucus to fight these issues because we know it affects us all.
That's right.
As well as there are those of us who are already starting to plan meetings so that we can, if we find that the Supreme Court doesn't do what we believe is right, form a legislative body that can put forth some legislation that we think will be helpful.
Well, we certainly haven't stopped talking about it on this show. We've been pushing it, frankly, from all 4 years we've been here. So we appreciate that. Ben, thanks a bunch. Congresswoman, you're going to be back later talking about sequestration. Thanks a bunch. We look forward to having you back.